Hello, welcome. I'll present my research project titled Self-Regulated Learning Skills and Behavior in Pre-Vocational Education in the Netherlands, which is an important topic because in the Netherlands there is a growing concern about the skills students in secondary education have when it comes to things like planning their work, monitoring their work, take real ownership, agentship for their own learning and motivational issues. Some studies on this terrain have been conducted on these issues, but mainly they were theoretical studies and or studies in higher education, the higher tracks in secondary education in the Netherlands. The studies that have been conducted in pre-vocational education were mostly cross-sectional and did not tell us something about the development of these skills over a longer period of time. In this research project, I want to understand if and how self-regulated learning skills develop during the 4 years of education at pre-vocational schools. Okay. Before I'm going to present the next study that will be conducted, I'll give you some information about the project as a whole and also on some key elements like pre-vocational education in the Netherlands. I'll explain very briefly something about self-regulated learning. Then I'll talk very briefly about the research project as a whole, and finally I'll talk about study 3 in the project, which will be the next study that I'm going to conduct. Okay. Well, in the Netherlands, students start secondary education around the age of 12 when they have finished primary education. Secondary education has 3 levels, of which pre-vocational education is considered the lowest track. Of all the students in secondary education, the group in pre-vocational education is the largest. Around 50% of the students in secondary education is in pre-vocational. Pre-vocational education takes 4 years to complete, and it grants admission to vocational education and training, as well as to the middle track in secondary education, which is called Higher General Secondary Education, or in Dutch, HAVO. Pre-vocational education has 3 different educational tracks. The theoretical track, TL, which is considered the highest track in pre-vocational education, offers only theoretical subjects and grants admission to the highest tracks in vocational education and training at level 4. The middle track is called Kader, KB, and it offers mainly theoretical subjects comparable to the theoretical track but on a lower level. And in Kader, students are also offered vocational subjects in their senior years for a limited amount of hours per week. Finally, the basis track in pre-vocational is regarded as the lowest track. And in this track, students choose a specialization from the start in which they will follow their education. For example, technical education, where they will be trained to be constructors or carpenters, or care and welfare, in which they will be trained to obtain a helping position in healthcare. Pre-vocational education, especially the lower tracks, have a very negative image in the Netherlands. It is associated with learning and behavioral problems, unqualified teachers, and it is seen as hierarchically lower than the other forms of secondary education. The negative image of the lowest form of education, combined with limited abilities for transfer, can negatively influence students' self-image and decrease their perceptions of future opportunities. Students in pre-vocational education run a higher risk of being diagnosed with learning difficulties, and they are also more often confronted with academic failure. Repeated negative perceptions of school performance may lead to a downward spiral of decreasing motivation and thus an increasing risk of dropping out of school or loss of well-being while attending school. Now, and this negative trend is reinforced when students do not have the ability to regulate their own motivation and their own learning behavior. So, self-regulation is seen as a prerequisite for durable effectiveness in learning and motivation. Despite the concerns about the average achievement levels in Dutch pre-vocational education, still very little is known about how self-regulated learning skills develop at this level of Dutch secondary education, from the first till the last year. All right. So, self-regulated learning is important to understand. And that is because the idea of what learning is has changed in modern society. Traditionally, the emphasis in learning was on reproduction of knowledge, but now it has shifted to a constructivist idea that for learning to occur, students have to build up and combine their prior knowledge with new knowledge and restructure and reconsider their own understanding. Demands in modern society require that students are equipped for lifelong learning, which is also self-regulated learning. And students will have to develop self-regulated learning skills like learning to learn, the ability to direct one's own learning process, etc., etc. And in pre-vocational education, it is crucial for students to learn actively from their practical task experiences because they learn in practice. And although there is no single straightforward definition of self-regulated learning, it is generally accepted that for self-regulated learning refers to the process in which students actively regulate their learning through cognitions, metacognitions, motivation, and learning behavior. And well, zoom in a little bit on self-regulated learning, or SRL. Most models distinguish three phases in a cyclic process. One is the forethought phase, two is the performance phase, three is the self-reflection phase. Now, in the forethought phase, learners plan their tasks and they set specific goals, and they organize information and resources as well as the physical settings according to their own preferences for working and learning. In the performance phase, learners monitor what they are doing. And monitoring helps learners to detect errors or deviations from their plan, allowing them to adjust or adapt strategies and look for new information. Finally, in the self-reflection phase, learners look for opportunities to assess and evaluate their task performances. During these different phases, various processes and activities that are regulated and adapted by these feedback loops take place. It is not simply a linear nor a static phase. The different phases may overlap or occur simultaneously, and attributions formed in the reflection phase, for example, may influence the other preparatory processes, etc., vice versa. This brings me to my research. What is it I want to know? Well, what I really want to know is how do these self-regulated learning skills and this behavior, how does it develop in students during their pre-vocational education from year 1 to year 4? Because there is so little known about this, and it is so crucial for understanding these students and eventually helping them grow more and more. Now, my research consists of 4 studies. 2 of them are qualitative and 2 of them are quantitative. So it's a mixed method approach. And I've chosen to gather data in different ways because every single method has its own weakness and strength, of course. But I think when I combine different ways of gathering data, that it will give a more complete image of SRL skills in these students over a period of time. In study 1, students fill in a self-report questionnaire, and I will tell a little bit more about it later in this presentation. In study 2, students will be observed directly while executing tasks in class by using think aloud protocols and direct observations. In study 4, the view of teachers on the development of these skills will be taken into account through semi-structured interviews. In study 3, which is more or less the backbone of my research, the survey from study 1 will be repeated several times with multiple cohorts in order to discover developments in these skills. And this will also be the next study I will perform, so I will come back to it later. It brings me to my research question of study 3. 2 questions. How and to what extent does self-regulated learning develop during pre-vocational education? I made a typo, I see. And how and to what extent does gender and educational level affect the development of self-regulated learning? So what do these factors, do they play a role, and if yes, what kind of role do they play in order to really understand how it works with these students? Now, how will I conduct this this study? Well, I will gather my data using a self-report survey, which is called MSLQ, and I will explain very briefly what it is in a minute. My sample consists of 1,750 students from 4 schools for pre-vocational education in the northeast of the Netherlands. It is students of year 1 till 4, so all years are covered, and the same goes for the educational tracks. I will gather data in TL, Kader, and Basis track. Okay. The MSLQ is an instrument which is used worldwide frequently to measure self-regulated learning. Now, I will not go into it too deep, but the official name is Motivated Strategies for Learning Questionnaire. It has two main parts: motivational skills and learning strategy skills. I will, in my research project, only use the learning strategy skills because of the number of items. It's pre-vocational students, so it's not doable to give them a survey with 81 questions. It's simply too much. So we had to make a choice there, which is, by the way, completely accepted. It's quite normal to only use parts of the MSLQ. Well, you can see the learning strategies have 2 scales, the cognitive and metacognitive skills, and also the resource management skills. And you can see we've got some subscales and the number of items which are here. In total, students get 51 questions, so which is already a quite a lot for students of this level. And I've done a pilot study with 127 students, and well, there we tested the material, and well, we discovered that around 50 was really the max for these students. Okay, now once we've received the data, we will analyze it through SEM, structural equation modeling. Use SPSS, of course, and we'll run also the scales, the data through Lizrael to find the model fits and see how reliable it is. Also, we will in M+ use latent growth models to discover and to investigate changes in self-regulated learning over the years. And as said, these growth curves, they will be calculated in M+. Okay. Well, practical significance. Well, of course, I think that's quite obvious. A better understanding of self-regulation development, and it can be used to develop new programs or improve existing programs, since schools, well, tend to implement all kinds of programs without really understanding or knowing how in pre-vocational education these skills and this behavior develops. So, which brings me to the last part, my questions. Well, they are here. Of course, self-report surveys are widely used, but they are also criticized, because the question is, do these self-reports really report skills and behavior, or do they report what respondents believe or like what they do? So the real question is, of course, should I use the MSLQ, or do you know an alternative instrument, perhaps? And the second one, in the first measurement, I had a sample size of 1,750 students, but only about 758 responded. This was partly due to COVID, since my measurement collided with the lockdown at schools. Do you think I could use these data, or should I start again and do an extra measurement, which is, of course, time-consuming, etc., etc.? So thank you for listening to me, and I hope we have a good conversation about these items.